Good evening and welcome to the Saturday evening Zoom session in the library at Calvary Road Baptist Church. I apologize for the state of my larynx. I caught a very slight cold on March the 2nd. I was preaching for a friend of mine the next day. I had to motor on, and my voice has been like this since March the 3rd. I'm not talking to anybody so that my voice can recover, but I guess because of my age, it is recuperating slowly. I feel good. I'm in no pain whatsoever. It's just that I sound more like Mel Torme than I do John Waldrip. My name is John Waldrip. I'm the pastor of the Calvary Road Baptist Church in Monrovia, California. This is Zoom session number 213, and the program is Ask the Pastor. Our church's website is www.calvaryroadbaptist.church, where you can find links to my Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday night sermons and Bible studies, and my Saturday Zoom sessions. All sermons and studies are available on YouTube and sometimes Rumble. As well, there you'll find links to two blogs. Musings of a Gospel Minister is mine, and JL's Journal is my daughter's, as well as links to some news items of significance to Christians. I also try to upload notices of next Sunday's sermons and quotations that are of interest to me, and sometimes writing my own comments about affairs. If you're watching this session on YouTube or Rumble, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel. If you'd like to receive an email invitation to join future live Zoom sessions, send your request to me and I will pass it on. As well, I'm scheduled for 3 p.m. Monday through Sunday on First Love Radio. If you'd like an email reminder 10 minutes before airtime, email me and ask me to add you to the reminder list, and you'll get a link that will be sent to you that you can use. The program consists of past sermons that have been recorded, sermons of mine that have been recorded and ever so slightly edited for broadcast. On that same live stream source, should you want to use it at another time, there are sermons by my friend Joe Jackowitz, the late D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, Ken Ham, Daniel Chamberlain, Dr. Peter Masters, and others. So if you have a question for me, including being put on the list of the reminder for First Love Radio, feel free to send the request, whatever it is, to pastor@calvaryroadbaptist.church. If you put Zoom 213 in the subject line, I will know which of our sessions you are referring to. Tonight, I will reflect on tonight is the beginning of a series in which I will reflect on a dilemma that I have been aware of since before my conversion to Christ. The problem I speak of tonight, that I begin speaking of tonight, is what I choose to label as the manageable man, with the official title of these sessions being the manageable man problem in our culture. Before we begin, let's go to the Lord in prayer, shall we? Father, thank you for your goodness. As always, I pray that you might restore the vitality to my throat, that you might bless our church services tomorrow, that I might be able to communicate effectively and not be distracting. Thank you for this opportunity, for this ministry, in Jesus' name, amen. This topic will be covered in no less than 8 sessions, with me having a keen interest in your comments and your feedback as we go. So please, please take whatever opportunity you have to send me a response and feedback at pastor@calvaryroadbaptist.church. Let's begin with the first of the 8 main topics that I plan on dealing with over the course of the next 2 months. First, I would like to relate to you the masculine influences in my early life. I look back on my life. I was not raised in a Christian home, but I got along wonderfully with my parents. And I look back on it, and in God's wonderful providence, I had a wonderful upbringing for which I'm very, very thankful. The only regret that I had growing up was that I did not grow up in a Christian home exposed to the gospel. I heard a gospel message when I was 6 years old. I was witnessed to very few times, just a couple of times, by my grandmother and an uncle. And I came to Christ in 1974 after graduating from engineering school. But a few minutes ago, maybe 2 hours ago, I began to reflect on my life and what masculine influences I, in retrospect, could look back on and recount from my early life. Let me begin with my father. My dad was a big man. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall. For most of his adult life, he weighed about 230, 235 pounds. He had the exact physical dimensions of the heavyweight champion Joe Louis, except he was 1/2 inch less around the bicep. How do I know? My mother, when she married my dad, she taped him because she realized, oh my goodness, this guy that I'm married to, wow, is he a piece of work? My dad was one of the very earliest weightlifters, bodybuilders. When he was in the military, he was coached by a guy named Grimmick, Grimek. Excuse me. If my memory serves me correctly, he was a bodybuilding champion and an Olympic weightlifting champion in the same year. But my dad, he grew up on a farm, a sharecropper's farm. He was third from the youngest, but by far the biggest of my grandfather's children. My dad was a very hardworking guy. When he went into the military, he matured, obviously, and so he had the influences growing up of being one of the sons of a very alpha male farmer. My grandfathers, both of them, were men with very large personalities. My dad was very quiet, a very quiet man, but he was quiet by choice. He was not quiet because of timidity, because my dad was almost always the biggest guy in the room. Because he was a lifelong reader, he was almost always the best informed man in the room. And as a result of him being a veteran of World War II, he had all of those involvements with other men being a part of what's called the greatest generation. That generation was a generation of men who were men. They were men who were manly. And so I had the benefit of having such a fellow as my dad. In addition to that, growing up around my dad's friends and colleagues, every single one of them that I can recall was somewhere in the category of being a veteran of World War World War II, either North Africa or Europe or the Pacific, and they were cowboys besides, and a number of them were police chiefs. So no matter how you reckon it, my dad's circle of friends and colleagues, in addition to the family that he grew up in, these were all men's men. And in addition to that, of course, from the time I was about 4 weeks old until I graduated from high school, I basically, not the entire time, but most of the time, we lived on Indian reservations in South Dakota, North Dakota, Florida, and then in Oregon. And if you know anything about life on an Indian reservation, you know that there is a stark contrast. It doesn't exist today because all Native American tribes are now woke. But back in the day when I lived on reservations, there was no overlap of responsibilities and duties between men and women. Men did always and only men things. Women did always and only women things. Let me just give you a few experiences. We first lived at Cherry Creek, South Dakota, part of the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwest South Dakota. And among my dad's friends, and this is the world that I lived in and was growing up in, one of my dad's friends was a woman named Kate Bluefeather. She was a Sioux. She and her husband had a baby boy, and they were at Wounded Knee when the United States Army attacked with orders to kill every man, woman, and child in what's now called the Massacre of Wounded Knee. Kate Bluefeather and her husband carried their newborn baby. They literally ran ahead of the mounted U.S. cavalry for 3 days and 3 nights. Most people don't realize that a person who's in good physical condition can outdistance anybody on a horse over time. The horse can run you down in a sprint, but if you're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 miles, there's no way a guy mounted on a horse is going to keep up with you if you're in good shape. And so Kate Bluefeather and her husband, imagine what kind of a man would do this. He carried his baby boy for 3 days and 3 nights. Then they arrived at Cherry Creek. So they're back on their reservation. The Army left him alone. He was so utterly exhausted and depleted that within 24 hours of getting back to Cherry Creek, he died. And so, excuse me, that guy was a man. He was a real man. In addition to that, my dad had another friend. So my dad never knew Kate Bluefeather's husband, but he knew her. And the kind of men that my dad associated with on the Indian reservation were those kind of men. One of his friends was the last living survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry were massacred. And that young man, at the time of that battle, he was 17 years old. He was the youngest of the warriors fighting for Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And he insisted until the day he died that nobody touched Custer. Nobody laid a hand on him. He was a coward, and he used his own revolver to commit suicide so that he would not be captured. So those were the kind of men on the Indian reservation. In addition to that, my dad worked with veterans who had gone to college on the GI Bill and then went into government service with my dad. One of them was a very close personal friend of my dad by the name of Joe Bill Little. Joe Bill Little went to Texas A&M, or excuse me, West Texas State in Canyon, Texas. Served in the United States Navy during World War II. I'm still in touch with his widow, who babysat me when I was just a little baby. In addition to that, there was a guy by the name of Martin Steinwan, who was a submariner. He was wounded in battle in his sub. A torpedo in the torpedo room came loose from its lashings and crushed Steinwan's chest, causing him to lose a lung. But this guy, I used to play with his son, who was a year younger than me. They lived across the street. His wife was crazy, but he was really a good deal. There was a guy in North Dakota who was a highly decorated World War II combat veteran. He was a Native American by the name of Mike Iron Moccasin. Mike Iron Moccasin was a Silver Star winner, highly decorated in the European Theater of Operations. When we lived in Florida, my dad's close personal friends included the two chiefs of the Seminoles, Bill and Billy Osceola. Bill and Billy were first cousins. One of them was an independent Baptist preacher. The other was a Southern Baptist preacher. I think Bill was the Southern Baptist and Billy was the independent Baptist. But they were good friends of my dad. I got along well with them and their family members. And these guys were the real deal. When we moved up to Oregon, across the street from me was a guy by the name of Rex Bray. He had been in the Army Air Corps, was captured by the Japanese at Clark Field in the Philippines. He served in the same prison camp my uncle was in for 3.5 years. His acts of bravery, according to my uncle, were astounding. My uncle's acts of bravery, according to Rex Bray, were astounding. In addition, there was also Bob Rutlinger, who was a B-17 pilot in World War II. On the reservation, because there was so much timber country there, there was just all manner of loggers and log truck drivers. And soon after we moved there, my dad took me. It was in the summertime, and there was a huge forest fire on the reservation. And so my dad took me to meet one of the guys that worked for him. He had a whole department of foresters working for him, and one of them was not a forester. His name was Vic Sisson. He was what's called the fire boss. What most people don't realize is that whenever there is a huge fire, like the grass fires that are currently plaguing the Texas Panhandle and the fires that we have every year in California and the Pacific Northwest, for every fire, there is a fire boss. While the fire is going on, that fire boss has absolute control over every asset that is used to fight that fire, whether it be helicopters, whether it be fire trucks, whether it be men on the ground, whether it be smoke jumpers who are jumping in with parachutes. And I had the opportunity of living in this world, these kinds of men growing up. And it had a dramatic impact on me and my personality because, excuse me, my estimation of all of these guys is that they were real men. They were the kind of real men that is a distinct rarity in the culture that we have in our country. So that's my dad and my dad's friends and the Indian reservation experiences that I grew up in for 18 years. And then there's my larger family, and that would be my grandparents. I had two of the greatest grandfathers you could ever imagine. Let me start with my dad's father. That would be Ross Waldrip. Ross Waldrip was married to Ruth, and they had 8 children. They had 2 girls and 6 boys. And my grandfather was a very, very, very hardworking sharecropper. He was not a successful farmer at all. And life for him was very, very hard. And for most of his life, he was a deeply embittered man, but he never shirked his responsibility. He just could never get ahead. And it was after he reached the age of about 60 that one of his sons, an uncle of mine that I'll tell you about, got for his father a job as a lubrication technician. That would be a grease monkey, working in a pit, squeezing oil into grease fittings on tractor trailer rigs for Navajo freight lines in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That job, which was hard for most people, was the easiest job my grandfather had ever done in his life, and he loved it. He was a man's man, and every single one of his sons, some of them were not good Christians. My grandfather was a wonderful Christian guy, but all of his sons were men. They were not all believers. Some of them were rascals, but they were rascals who were men. There were no sissy boys in his family. That's my paternal grandfather. And by the way, the woman that he married, Ruth Lacoste, her dad, my great grandfather on my dad's side, Francois Lacoste, was a Quebecois. He emigrated from French Canada to Boston, signed on to a whaler, went around the world on a whaler. When he got back, the United States was involved in a civil war, so he joined the United States Navy, was on a blockade ship off the coast of Galveston, Texas, took his discharge in 1965 and became a Texas Ranger. He is the only French Canadian to ever serve as a Texas Ranger, and he is prominently displayed in the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame in Waco, Texas. I've seen it myself. So that's on my dad's side. My maternal grandfather was a guy named John Connor. He was the guy that I was named after. My mom wanted me to be named Stephen, but when my mom delivered me, my dad went and told the nurses his name is going to be John Stephen Waldrip. My dad wanted me named after his father-in-law, my grandfather, John Connor. He was a towering man for his day. Imagine a man born before the turn of the century who was 6'3". By the way, his father, my great-grandfather on that side, was 6'5". But the kind of man my grandfather was, he he quit school when he was in 3rd grade, and he became the sole provider for his mother and his younger siblings when he was 10 years old. My grandfather started buying and selling livestock, started farming. You say, well, that's impossible. I'm sorry, but Ulysses S. Grant started farming when he was 8 years old. Okay? So back in those days, little boys did not look forward to adolescence. Little boys grew up. They became men as soon as possible, and they started functioning like men as soon as possible. Both of my grandfathers were men long before boys become men in the culture we presently are involved in. Now let me get to my uncles. I had great uncles. My mom had one brother by the name of N.T. Connor. N.T. Connor served in the United States Army Air Corps. He washed out of flight school, so he became a mechanic, crew chief, maintaining P-47s. I had a number of Jeeps shot out from under him as the as the U.S. troops pushed across Europe. But he was a wonderful guy. I got along with him mostly well for most of his life. On the other side of the family, my dad's older brother, 5 years older than him, Leon Waldrip. I've told my church about this guy. He was captured at Corregidor, served as a prisoner of war in a Japanese prison camp for 3.5 years. After World War II was over, he then joined up in 1950 and he became a United States Marine. He was at the Chosin Reservoir. My uncle Leon, I'm telling you what, he was really a piece of work. I profoundly admired that man growing up. My dad and my uncle's brother-in-law, married to their sister Ruth, was a guy named Bill Thomas, who served in the United States Navy. Another one of my dad's brothers was a guy by the name of Earl Waldrip, another one by the name of Kenneth Waldrip, another by the name of David Waldrip. David was the only one that I know of who did not serve in the armed forces because he was too young. He simply was too young to join up, too young to be drafted. But Earl Waldrip and Kenneth Waldrip, they both served in the United States Marine Corps. If I recall correctly, both of them were guys that had flamethrowers. So in the march across the South Pacific, these were the guys that would go up to the caves where Japanese soldiers were hiding, and they would blowtorch them with flamethrowers. My high school friends, I lived in Madras, Oregon, the last 3 years before graduating from high school. And they had a great group of guys. One of the guys I graduated from high school with became a Navy SEAL and was a Navy SEAL for most of his enlistment. Then one of them, still a close personal friend, became a police chief. Several of the guys that I went to school with became contractors. One of them became a highway patrol officer. Another one has lived his life in the Seattle area, Puget Sound area, running a fishing business. I say all that to say this. The world in which I grew up was very much a masculine world. It was a world in which every single man that I came into contact was in every way a man. The Native Americans, the American Indians, those were men's men. They lived in a very male-oriented culture, not at all like the culture of the United States, but it was a masculine culture. And in that day, as I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, the United States was a masculine culture. And my dad, although he was a well-educated guy and he was a desk jockey for 30 years, what he had come from was a hard life of hard work. And he related well to all of these people. He did not think less of them because they were engaged in manual labor. He knew what it was like. He had done that himself. And my mom told me one time that she had never seen a man work harder than my dad. And so I had masculine examples to help me out and to be a blessing to me. And so as we deal with this series of the manageable man and this issue of the manageable man problem in our culture, I want you to know I fully recognize that I'm a throwback. I fully recognize that I'm a dinosaur. I'm nothing like the kind of adult male that's being turned out by our culture, by our school system, by so many of our churches, by HR in so many companies, and it began to bother me early on, even while I was a lost guy. And so those, just to, as a form of biography, so you'll know where I'm coming from, those were the intensely masculine influences that I was privileged to be exposed to in my early life. And looking back on those experiences, but for the fact that I was not a Christian, but for the fact I did not grow up in a Christian home, but for the fact that I was not exposed to the gospel except clearly one time before I came to Christ that I can recall. I have so much to be thankful for, because I grew up in an environment of manliness. It wasn't Christian manliness for the most part, with the exception of my youngest uncle, Uncle David. He was a wonderfully godly guy. Leon Waldrip became a believer in 1965. He ended up being a wonderful Christian. Bill Thomas came to Christ and ended up being a Baptist pastor for so many years. So I had wonderful advantages that I am so profoundly grateful to God for. Now, next week, Lord willing, I want to share with you some of the non-masculine influences that I observed. I don't think they affected me very much because I was aware of them, I was alerted to them, and I sought to avoid them by every means possible. So for that, we'll wrap it up this evening with a word of prayer. But let me just remind you, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, if there's a direction that you would like for this series to go, please feel free to reach out and email me at pastor@calvaryroadbaptist.church. Thank you so much. Let's dismiss now, shall we, and wrap this up in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your goodness. Pray that you might strengthen my voice for tomorrow. Give in each of the churches that we are attending wonderful, wonderful blessings. The Spirit of God might have free course in each person's life. And for this, we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night. And